Good evening. If you'd like to open up to Genesis chapter 32, that's where we'll spend our time together this evening. Genesis chapter 32. We started a couple of weeks ago thinking and meditating on this text, and tonight we'll wrap that up under the title of Limping into the Light. We've been talking about Jacob, the Old Testament character, whose name means deceiver. And literally, it means heel grabber, which is the image of grabbing at someone's heel to trip them. And that really embodies what Jacob's all about. He is all about winning. He's all about obtaining the blessing for himself, at least in parts of his life. He's really been burning bridges since in the womb when he's fighting his brother Esau to be the first one to emerge, because he views this world as a dog-eat-dog world, where in order for him to get ahead, you have to eat his dust. And so, 20 years ago, by the time we get to Genesis chapter 32, was the last time that Jacob was in the same room with his twin brother Esau. At that point, Esau had gotten so fed up with Jacob's shenanigans that Esau had decided that he was going to murder his own twin brother in cold blood. And so Esau is plotting to kill his brother. Jacob gets wind of it. He tricks Esau one more time, gets ahead on him, hits the road, and hasn't seen him in 20 years. That's the last time they were together. Well, now Jacob has burned one too many bridges, and so he's having to come back home. He's coming back to face his brother. And so he sends messengers ahead to Esau to tell him that he's coming. And he's hoping that this is going to be a beautiful reunion of these twin brothers, haven't seen each other in a couple of decades. And his messengers come back, and you might remember that they tell him that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men. And so Jacob hears that, and he realizes this is not going to be a happy family reunion. This is not going to be a beautiful Hallmark movie moment. I don't know if they have family reunions in Hallmark movies. I've seen like maybe one, but I'm just assuming that they do because it sounds like a Hallmark thing. It's this beautiful moment that Jacob is not going to have because these 400 men are coming to meet him with Esau. And let's pick up in verse 22 of Genesis 32. The same night he arose. This is the night before meeting with Esau. So the same night he arose, took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. So on the brink of his reunion with Esau, he's all alone, right? He sent all of his possessions, all of his family across, and now he's alone. In fact, if you were to read the beginning of chapter 32, and Ken, you might have to advance the slide for me. If you were to read from the beginning and then read through the beginning section of chapter 33, you might notice that Esau is mentioned several times in the first part of chapter 32, verses 1 through 22, and then the first part of chapter 33. Esau is mentioned 9 times and then 6 times. In the first part of chapter 32, Jacob's family is mentioned 3 times, and then after, in chapter 33, 15 times. And then also, in the first part of chapter 32, his possessions are mentioned 24 times, and afterward, 3 times. But you notice that in the middle there, in our text, and that should be 32, 23 through 32, in our text, there are 0 mentions of any of these 3 items or categories. And the point seems to be to emphasize that Jacob is all alone in this moment. His family's not there. His possessions aren't there. Esau is waiting right around the corner, and he's all alone for what happens next. One more thing to notice as we look at this. Notice how before this text, before what we're talking about tonight, there are several mentions of possessions, right? There are 24 mentions of possessions, only 5 mentions afterward. Also notice beforehand, his family is only mentioned 3 times, afterward 15 times. So there seems to be a shift inside of Jacob in his priorities at this point in his life. That something that happens on this night changes how Jacob views the world. Remember that we are Western readers of Scripture, that we are citizens of the United States of America in the 21st century. And so we're reading this ancient Near Eastern text from our own perspective. That's okay, it's good. But we also sometimes need to be reminded that this was written by ancient Near Easterners for ancient Near Easterners. And one thing that we'll notice if we put on those ancient Near Eastern glasses for just a second is that when we read about this ford here in the text in verse 22, They saw fords on the edge of a land as a gateway into the land. So as he crosses this ford, he's entering into this gateway, into this land. And also, they thought of, oftentimes, the gods as protecting this ford, this gateway. So the gods or their servants would stand at attention at this ford, this gateway into the land, and guard the entrance. And so if we're reading this just as a normal ancient Near Easterner, not even an Israelite, just reading this text, we're thinking, okay, this is a time of transition in Jacob's life. He's come to a ford. He's come to a crossing, right? It's like crossing the Rubicon with Julius Caesar. He's come to the Rubicon, and what's going to happen next? So for Jacob, this is a transitional time in his life. This is a night that's going to change the rest of his life. So let's keep reading in verse 24. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Now there's the guard, right? It seems. Here's the guard of the gateway. He's wrestling with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, you might have a lot of questions that are coming to you if this is the first time you've read this text, or at least the first time in a while. We talked about those a couple weeks ago, so I'll refer you to that. But tonight, I want us to look at how short the account is of this fight. It maybe is the most interesting thing, at least on the surface, to me in this text, maybe to you as well. But it's over in like 2 sentences. The fight starts and then it ends, and that's it. That's our account of the fight. So if you just look at the difference in length, you'll notice that the point of this text is not to tell us about the fight. It's the dialogue that comes after in verses 26 through 30. That's the point. That's what all of this is moving toward. The fight is getting to that. And let's start reading in verse 26. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Now, pause there. Remember, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but remember that this narrative intentionally focuses on the name of Jacob, right? On the screen, you'll have the first half of our text, and in the gray highlights, those are words that intentionally rhyme with Jacob. They have the same consonantal makeup as the name Jacob does in Hebrew. So all over this text, there are words that are intentionally chosen, it seems, to emphasize that this is all centering around Jacob. Particularly the word wrestled is one of these words, and we talked about how you could say that Jacob is Jacobing at the Jabbok. Jacob is wrestling at the Jabbok River. Jacob is Jacobing at the Jabbok, because they're all intentionally rhyming with each other. The point is that this is all centering around Jacob's name. And this black highlight at the bottom emphasizes that there are also several mentions of name, either the verb form or the noun form in this text. So on this screen as well, this is the second half. You'll see that several times, over and over again, it's calling you to see that the point of this is Jacob's name. That's why we mentioned that Jacob's name means deceiver, means heel grabber, because this is a moment of transition for Jacob. Because what's about to happen is that name that has really typified his entire life to this point. He's been a fighter. That's what he's all about. It's about getting ahead. He's tripping the person in front of him in order for him to advance. His name, who he is about to change. And that's embedded in the wording of the story itself. So let's keep reading. Verse 28. That's where it starts on the screen, by the way. Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. Now, pause there. This is interesting to me because I've been calling this a dialogue, verses 26 to 30. Now, a dialogue is when two people are speaking with each other, right? There's a banter, a back and forth. But is it really a dialogue? Well, in verse 26 it is. And then also in verses 27 and 29, those are dialogical, I guess that's a word, dialogical texts. But verse 28 is not. Verse 28 is a monologue. It's one person speaking. It's a declaration to Jacob from this man. It's not a conversation, it's a declaration. You will now be called Israel. So what this man is doing is reaching into the well-run wheel ruts of Jacob's life. Like, let's just say that Jacob has been treading the same path metaphorically every day. It's like he drives to work, he drives home, drives to work, drives home, every day of his life. And this is a metaphor for his character, that he is who he is, and he has been from the womb, from when he was fighting with his brother to be the first one to emerge out of their mother. This is how he is, this is who he is. Those are the wheel ruts of his life. And this man is reaching into those wheel ruts and shifting their course. He's turning Jacob's character to a different angle. He's saying, you are changing on this night. Now, if we've been reading through Genesis to this point, we've already seen that Abram has had his name changed to Abraham. Sarai has become Sarah. But you can see in those two names, there's more of a continuity, right? Sarah, Sarai, Abram, Abraham. It's pretty obvious, the connection between those. But Jacob and Israel is more dramatic. This shift is more dramatic. Israel, the word means God wrestles, God fights, God strives. But notice that in the text, this inspired narrator points us not only to the idea of God wrestling, but of Jacob wrestling, right? He says it here, that you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So, God wrestles, yes, but also Jacob wrestles, because it takes two to tango, right? God might pick this fight, but Jacob also has to show up. And the reason why we're talking about this tonight, the reason why we're returning to this and looking at it from what I hope is a different perspective, is because this whole story is a striking image to me of what it takes for a person or a group of people to change. It's a striking image of what it takes for a person or persons to change. What we have to experience, many of us at least, in order to change something in our lives. Because this is how Israel, the nation, comes onto the scene. This is their origin story. They don't come about through success or through shrewdness or through acquiring land. That's not how they come onto the scene. They come onto the scene through an assault from God, right? And maybe that's grace. We might call that grace. But it's not what we typically think of as grace, right? When we think of grace, we think of something that's warm and cuddly and inviting, and that's appropriate, that's good, that's grace. But I think this is also grace, but it looks very different from what we might expect. Because Jacob is not consulted about his new identity, right? This man doesn't ask him, "What do you want to be?" There's not a question here, right? It's given to him. It's even imposed upon him. You will be Israel from now on. That is who you are. And when the sun rises, the stranger's just gone. There's no mention of him anywhere else in Jacob's life, this man, at least by the same name, calling him a man. There's no mention of him in Jacob's life. He's gone, and so is Jacob. And in Jacob's place is Israel, who hadn't slept well the night before. That's what we're left with. If you notice, in this shift between verses 29 and 30, that there's no mention of Jacob letting go of this man. There's no mention of the fact or how this man disappears. It's just, and he blessed him, and Jacob starts talking as though the man's not there. There's an abrupt shift. And I think the point is to draw our attention to what comes next. So Jacob, verse 30, called the name of the place Peniel, and that Peniel just means face of God, the face of God, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." Now this is interesting, because if you were to read in other places in the Old Testament, people don't see God and live to tell the tale. That's mentioned at least a few times, that you don't see God face to face and live. In the New Testament, it says, no one has ever seen God at any time. Yet Jacob here, he says, I've seen God, and my life has been delivered. So Jacob, Israel, is the exception. He sees God, and he fights God. He wrestles with God. Now look at verse 31. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel. Now Peniel is just an alternative way of saying Peniel. I have no idea why they chose to mix this up so close together, but it's the same place. So the sun is rising upon him as he passed Peniel. So if you were to read back in Genesis, When Jacob fled from his home 20 years ago, when he tricked Esau one last time and Esau had enough and Jacob had to get out of Dodge, the sun was setting as he fled across the Jordan River. And now, poetic justice, it's rising as he comes back into his homeland. So we might look at this as the cosmos smiling upon Jacob, promising security, blessing, protection, prosperity, that all is right in the world for Jacob, right? He's encountered God face to face. He's faced his fears. He has a cool new name. The sunrise is coming up. Everything is right in the world, except, you notice that I stopped reading at verse 31. It says, limping because of his hip. So everything is set right, except here he is, limping away from this scene. So meeting with this God did not lead to, as we might imagine, easy reconciliation and forgiveness and healing like we might want it to. It didn't lead to that. It resulted in a crippling. And as always, Jacob won. Jacob's a winner. That's what he does throughout his life. But that victory comes at a cost because he limps from this scene. And I think if we might can say that them's the kicks of life. Like that's just how life works. That when we experience life, it exacts a cost upon us. And sometimes that's physical. Sometimes you might walk away with a literal limp and a lesson that you've learned. But it's also spiritual, it's also emotional, that we carry the scars of this life. That experiencing the life that God has given us and is giving us exacts a toll on us. Now, for someone who has received multiple explicit and direct promises from God of protection and blessing and security, Jacob goes through a lot in his life. We talked about that last time. 3 times God appears to Jacob and he promises that he is chosen. He will be blessed. But if you follow Jacob's life, some of this is self-imposed, but he still goes through it anyway. His brother, as we talked about, plots to murder him. He flees alone without anyone into a foreign land. And then he's cheated out of more than a decade of his life by Laban, just serving Laban. Before long, after this, Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, who he worked for all of those years, passes away during childbirth. And then his daughter, Dinah, has horrible things done to her by a man. And Jacob's son, Reuben, sleeps with Bilhah, who is Jacob's concubine, which is a kind of a wife. So his son sleeps with his kind of wife. Jacob's own sons trick him into thinking that his favorite son, Joseph, died a horrible death, only to find out years later that he didn't actually die a horrible death, but his own sons and Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, and he was taken to a different country, right? So not much better than dying a horrible death. And so Jacob goes through a lot in his life, especially for someone who has this explicit, direct promise from God that I'll protect you, I will bless you. And I think this limp is a direct consequence of this night of wrestling, but it's also symbolic of the scars of his life, that it stands for everything else that he goes through in his life. And I think for us, it serves as this powerful image of a God who in this case has to wound in order to heal, who has to strike Jacob in order to get Jacob to receive the blessing that he's been trying just to gift to him all along. But Jacob's been scratching and clawing his way toward it, never realizing that it's free. If we can borrow the language of Paul from the New Testament, that this is a free gift from God. Because after Peniel, Jacob's a changed man. Before the Jabbok, Jacob skulks behind his family and he uses them as a shield. He puts them in between him and Esau. But then after this night, Jacob goes ahead of his family. He's humble, but he's confident. And he meets Esau, and he welcomes whatever comes. He opens himself up to Esau. It's almost this thought of, I've wrestled with God. What can man do to me, right? And then he tries his best to re-gift the blessing that he stole from Esau, to give it back to Esau. So he's trying his best to be different. So it seems like through this experience at Peniel, Jacob has been reborn as Israel, that he's a new man. And for all of that, as we read about this from Jacob, It's really this heroic and powerful and beautiful story that has never happened to me, and I'm willing to bet has never happened to you either, right? And so if you read this, you might be left with just wondering, as you sit in your struggles, the struggles of your life, the struggles of your faith, has everyone else just experienced this renaming, and I've just been left with my birth name, right? Has everyone else experienced something like this, where they experience a purpose in life from God? They experience a place to belong from God. They experience a change in identity, this beautiful calling to be Israel. And if you're wondering that, if you keep reading in Genesis, you're faced with the question, how different is Jacob really after this experience? Because this is beautiful, it's powerful. Earlier in Genesis, Jacob sees this vision of a ladder, and there are angels ascending and descending, and he's encountering God in this beautiful and powerful way that's really stands in contrast to the griminess of wrestling on the ground all night. So this ladder vision, where Jacob experiences God. But after all of that, if you notice, if you're still looking at Genesis 32, his name is changed in verse 29, and then what does it do in verse 30? The narrative calls him Jacob. Is that weird to you? His name was just changed, but here he is, Jacob. And then again, in verse 32, Jacob's hip. So right away, he's still Jacob. Now Abram, when his name was changed to Abraham, he's always Abraham after that, never Abram. But Jacob, sometimes he's Israel, but more often than not, he's just Jacob. Once again, throughout the rest of the Bible, he's just Jacob. In chapter 33, he tries to manipulate Esau with flattery and gifts. And then Esau does a really hospitable thing, invites Jacob to come with him. Jacob doesn't want to, and so he lies. He tells Esau, you go ahead, I'll meet you there. And he doesn't intend to do that, and he never does. So Jacob is still Jacob. He's still Jacob after this moment. There's not a fairy tale here. There's no happily ever after. It's a new beginning for sure, but he's still Jacob. He's a fighter. If you read Jacob's story from beginning to end, it's fascinating. And I'm telling you, that thread is what stitches it all together, that he's a fighter. And what happens here on the banks of the Jabbok River doesn't cut that line. It doesn't cut the thread of the fighter inside of Jacob. It just adds a new twine to the stitch. That Israel doesn't cancel out Jacob, it contains it. Israel, God wrestles. Jacob wrestles with God. So there's still fighting inherent within this. Jacob's still scratching and clawing. He's still who he is. But he has this new calling from God. So the question is, so what? Was there no change, or did he just revert back very quickly? What did that look like, and what does it mean for us? Well, I want to close out together tonight with two poems. I didn't write them. This first one is by Elva McAllister. No idea who that is, but these words are powerful. We're jumping in about halfway through the poem. But it says, alone, he had to grapple through that direst night against strange, friendly, fierce, contending arms. When dawn air filled his desperate lung lobes, the kindly enmity bestowed, new name, new blessing, new and unremitting signal, limp. Tonight, I make my frightened way toward some relentless Jabbok, where muse or angel or their cinder self awaits. I come, a muscled nameless. I have left the others sleeping. I have left the plashing ford. You, ruthless, grip me. Will a Jabbok be a Peniel one more time? Now there's a lot of depth in several of the lines that we read, but we're not going to break them all down. But I hope you can focus on the last three lines there. You, ruthless, grip me. Will a Jabbok be a Peniel one more time? Now what does it mean when he says that? Okay, think about it. The Jabbok is a place of fear, a place of dread, a place of anxiety, where Jacob wrestles all night long on the eve of his reunion with Esau. So he's facing his past, or about to. He's facing the guilt, the shame, the fear. that has come due. His balance has come due, and here he is on the banks of the Jabbok facing it. So that's what the Jabbok stands for in the poem and for us. It stands for this literal tossing and turning all night long with your past. And that's where Jacob comes face to face with God. That is Peniel. I think that's the point of that last question. Will a Jabbok, will the place of fear, will the place where I'm not in control, where I'm wrestling with this man who obviously has an earthly power, I'm wrestling with him all night long, will a Jabbok be a Peniel one more time? Will I encounter God in this place where I may not have expected to? And it makes me think that maybe the real name change in this text is the one that Jacob enacts, the one where it goes from Jabbok to Peniel. Because Israel to Jacob gets all the headlines. That's the flashy one. But I think that maybe the key to it all is that on the banks of the Jabbok, on the very edge between who he is and who he was and who he can become, Jacob comes face to face with his God. And that changes him to the extent that he changes the name of this place. So my exhortation to you is that if you are trying to find God, and hopefully we all are, whatever that looks like, wherever you are on that journey, hopefully we all are. So if you're trying to find God, don't just look to Jacob's ladder. Don't just look to the pulpits and to the pews. Look to those places, but don't just look where you might first expect God to be. Also look to the Jabboks. Look to the sleepless nights. Look to the heartbreaks. Look to the questions that you have, the struggles, the doubts, the fears. Look to the Jabboks. And you might just find that your Jabboks are also Peniels, just like Jacob did. I say that because that's life. Most of us don't experience a dramatic moment where we're sorry and then all of a sudden we're a saint. That's not how most of us experience life. It's not that we go from Israel to Jacob all of a sudden and we're never, or from Jacob to Israel and we're never Jacob again. So I think if we're only seeking God in our best moments, when I feel like it, when I feel up to it, if I'm only seeking Him when the power's on, and when I don't have a tree down, and when I'm not cold, and when I didn't have a storm, if I'm only seeking Him when everything's right in my world, I might miss what Jacob experienced here, encountering Him on the banks of the Jabbok. I think about Jesus, who, after He gets up from His own grave, appears to His disciples, and they don't believe that it's Him. I don't know about you. I've never seen a person get up from his own grave, so I relate. But they're asking him, who are you? Are you really Jesus? And what does he tell? I think it's Thomas in the Gospel of John. He says, look at the hole that's in my hand and in my side. It's pretty hard to fake that, right? So he says, look, it's me. I went through this. I died, and I'm back. That's proof of the victory that he won. And that's all that Jacob ever wanted. He wanted to win. He wanted to be blessed, and he finally is, but what happens to him? Just like Jesus, he walks away with a limp. He walks away with the wounds of his blessing. And I think that's part of getting down onto the mats and wrestling with this God who wrestles, with Israel, the God who wrestles. It's part of that is walking away with this limp. Part of it is walking away changed. Maybe in ways that we would never have asked for or wanted to experience, but changed nonetheless. I want to leave you with these words. This is the second poem I mentioned called Patient Trust, and I'm not going to even try to mention or read out the name of the Frenchman who wrote this, because I would not do well with that. But I'll read you this excerpt from the poem. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything, to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new. Give our Lord the benefit of believing that His hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. I'm not who I want to be. Maybe you also have that feeling. But we're called to trust in the slow work of God. That, as Paul says to the Corinthians, to trust that God is transforming us from glory to glory into the image of his Son. That day after day, we are becoming who God wants us to be as we put our trust and obedience in him. Tonight, if you need to begin that journey, won't you do it as we stand and sing together?